We're gonna start.
Okay. My favorites. That is real. Okay. Just taste this.
Okay. Welcome everyone. That sounded so sad. I guess this is it. Could be better. Okay. Welcome everybody. Back to Literary Whodunnits, Detective Fiction Masters in Crime, the presentation part, the edutainment part. Okay, so you've just had a wonderful time solving a murder in the bookstore. You're riding high on that adrenaline, but the fun is not over yet, okay? Because this is what we're gonna do. I'm gonna need you to close your eyes, and if you hate the sight of the back of your eyelids, you can just envision with me that you are in a locked room with no windows. And what's spread out across the floor? Why, you can open your eyes now. It's a murder mystery novel. Ooh. And the question is, of course, how did it get there? Well, let me tell you something. So, crime has existed in fiction and literature for a very long time, pretty much as long as literature itself has existed. I mean, you think about the Bible. One of the very first stories that we get there is a murder story, Cain and Abel. Classical antiquity, Oedipus is trying to figure out who killed the king. The answer will shock you, and also him. Shakespeare, Macbeth is a story of murder. Hamlet is a story of murder and also detection. Again, trying to figure out who killed the king. Kings are just dropping left and right in literature. But it's not until about the 18th century that crime as its own genre really comes into being, or begins to come into being at least. Part of this is because of the origins of true crime. One of the most popular publications during the 18th century was what's called the Newgate Calendar. Newgate was a notorious prison in London for a really long time. And what the Newgate Calendar was this series of highly sensationalized, semi-fictionalized accounts of the most famous criminals and murderers. And it was in almost every house, right? I mean, you've got your Bible, you've got your Pilgrim's Progress, you've got your Book of Martyrs, and you've got your Newgate Calendar for the weekdays. Welcome back. So, really, really popular. Everyone's just eating this up. Like, it's met with mass success that really hasn't been seen for something like this before. And on a much smaller scale, we also have the publication of what are called broadsides. And these are like just big sheets of paper, like newspapers, with text on just one side. And these are like 18th, 19th century tabloids. You've got crazy, salacious, grotesque stories that are being plastered across these. Stories of murders as the cases are going on. Stories of murderers, stories of the execution of murderers. Ballads written about the murderers so that you can go off to the pub and sing songs of death with your friends and have a grand old time. So these are really, really popular. People are really lapping this up. But in fiction, we also get this movement toward crime and just an overall interest in intrigue and mystery. This is especially evident in the genre of the Gothic novel. These are stories, of dark and stormy nights, cold, mysterious castles, powerful men with dangerous secrets, literal skeletons in the closet, and heroes and heroines trying to sift through all of the mystery and trying to figure out what's actually going on here. So we have crime and fact, or at least fictionalized fact and fiction, really coming into its own during this era, which leads us into the 19th century, where we have other genres also popping up that are interested in crime. The Newgate novel is one of these. The most famous probably being Oliver Twist. This is the novel in its first edition. 1837. And these are just stories about criminals and stories of their crimes, the kind of seedy underbelly of urban life. And people love it. Later in the century, we get the rise of the sensation novel, which also, has its root in a fascination with the grotesque and with intrigue. But instead of happening in the underworld of London, let's say it's happening in the sprawling manor house in the countryside. Kind of like the Gothic novel in that you have these unassuming people, powerful people, suddenly with these really dark and dastardly secrets. But it's also important to note that along with these developments in fiction, developments in fact are also taking really significant shape. Police forces, for instance, didn't exist as official, governmental, regulated things in most countries until at least the 19th century. The first detective force also comes to being in the 19th century. This is 1842 with the Metropolitan Police in London. And so we start to get new developments in crime and fiction, but we're also getting developments of crime and crime prevention in fact. And fiction is almost always going to follow fact to some degree. And so as soon as we get professional detectives, we can get professional detectives in fiction, which is what happens. But another really, really important development in the 19th century for detective fiction is the serial or the short story. This is important for, several reasons, but the two that I want to focus on for this whistle-stop tour is, one, we get recurring characters. So this is when we start to get recognizable detectives, because they just keep popping up in really digestible forms, and so characters can rise to pop culture status, iconic pop culture status in unprecedented ways. Think Sherlock Holmes, for instance. Who here has not heard of Sherlock Holmes? Oh, you silly goose. So Sherlock Holmes only appears in 4 novels, actually, but he appears in so many short stories. That's where he lives most of his fictional life. But it also is the short story is also really important in the structural development of the detective genre, because this allows people in that short form to experiment with what works and what doesn't work with detective fiction. And so this is when we start to get the formula. The body is found, the detective is called in, there are a few red herrings, and then the mystery is solved. Which leads us, of course, into the next century, the 20th century, and the golden age of detective fiction in Britain. So in the 19th century, we get some people experimenting, kind of poking around with how detective fiction works. In the 20th century, it becomes like a religion for some of these people. It's not just oh yeah, detective fiction works better if you maybe do this. It's no, you have to do this or it doesn't count. We won't acknowledge its presence. There are standardized rules now. People are actually publishing commandments. They call them commandments of detective fiction. They're getting crazy about this sort of thing. There are clubs. The Detection Club is formed in London and has the likes of Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers and all that, and all those sorts of people involved in it, establishing what actually is this genre. The emphasis shifts, or at least becomes greater on the mystery itself. It becomes not just more central, but almost the sole kind of entity of these books. And not just the mystery, but the puzzle aspect of the mystery. People want convoluted murders and they want convoluted solutions. And a big reason for this is at this time there's a massive appeal of stories that take chaos and turn it into order. So the golden age of detective fiction happens more or less from the 1910s into the 50s, 60s, but its peak happens during the interwar years. This is the 1920s and 1930s. You can imagine this is a time of huge anxiety for an enormous number of people. There's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of weird political goings-on the other side of the English Channel, and so this idea to make chaos into order in these really nice, neat stories is is so cathartic, is so therapeutic for these people. This is also when the crossword comes into being. People just love solving puzzles. The board game Clue is first published in 1949. Again, this time of uncertainty. The other murder mystery games are really popular in this period. And another key feature of the Golden Age detective novel is what's called, in kind of disparaging terms, snobbery with violence, which I only recently realized is a play on words for robbery with violence. Of course! Snobbery with violence is just refers to the tendency of these novels to have really convoluted and very bloodless murders. You know, death by radio, death by blowgun, and even when people are stabbed or shot, hardly any blood is ever drawn. And it's happening in the upper echelons of society. So very civil murders happening with very civil people. And it's all just good and fun and cozy. This, of course, elicits a response from our friends across the Atlantic, meaning us, the Americans, where we get crime fiction that is going for the jugular, right? It's like, no, let me tell you what crime really looks like, and so you have the hard-boiled, cynical private eye, as opposed to the eccentric amateur sleuth of British fiction, trying to solve these really grisly murders in these really urban settings that are just perpetually in black and white, right? So there we go. This is kind of the makings of detective fiction, and the reason why the novel, which is in our locked room with no windows, is specifically a murder mystery novel. That is how it got there. But wait, I can hear you all saying now, something is afoot. And let me tell you what that is. It's that no novel, mystery or otherwise, can grow legs and make little tracks itself through the annals of time. So the question really that we're asking is, who are the key figures in the history of mystery? In other words, who done the whodunit? Before we go on, I just want to know, is there anyone here who has never played the game Clue before? Well, my condolences to you. You've had a lot of time to rectify it, and it's just going to mean that there's some visual references that go over your head. Not on us, though. Not on us. So this is when we turn the investigation partially over to you. What we have here are a list of suspects, if you will, of these key contributors to the history of mystery. And your job now is to choose which case files we're going to open, which deep dives are we going to go into. So I open it now up to you to decide who and what we're going to talk about. Yes? Charles Dickens, my boy Chuck Dickens. Love that guy. Okay, so what we are saying then is it was Charles Dickens with Inspector Bucket in Bleak House. Do we stand by this accusation? Shall we go on?
Aye.
Yes! Yes, let's try that again. Shall we go on?
Yes.
There it is. Thank you for indulging me. All right, so Charles Dickens and his crime eras. Let me make a little introduction here. Our boy Chuck Dickens loves a good crime, or loves a good criminal, loves a good detective. He is all about that no body, no crime life. Not really, he just really, really loves crime, or had a really long interest, or long history in crime. So here we go. Here we're walking into Charles Dickens' office. He's young, he's about 15 years old. This portrait may deceive you, because he is now, he's in his initial, his first era, his first crime era, his law clerk era. So when he's 15, he becomes a law clerk for the very first time. The following year, he becomes a law clerk at another firm. Shortly after, he enters his court reporter era. So he's this little stenographer in all these courtrooms, just, scribbling down the facts of the case, the goings-on of the trial. A few years down the road, he begins writing Newgate novel. This is one of his first, Oliver Twist. And so he's now writing about these criminals. He's writing about crime, and he has criminals and crime in a lot of his fiction thereafter. And it's something that he revisits toward the end of his life. Charles Dickens was of course famous as a writer, but he was also famous as a reader. He did these tours in the last couple decades of his life, where he would read the most popular passages of his novels to these, enormous crowds. And one of the most popular scenes that he would reenact was this murder that happens in Oliver Twist. And it was, this guy went ham, okay? He would get so into it, he just beat and beat and beat and beat this, imaginary body, as these people are horrified and looking on and getting more and more stressed out and just unsettled, and they're like, oh, I don't really know what's happening, and they would have these visceral reactions, and it was crazy. And he was so intense in his reenactments of these scenes that it actually did shorten the span of his life. He just exerted himself a bit much. So is murder the cause of Charles Dickens' death? I'll let you decide. Anyway, so later, so we're going back to the 1820s, 1830s, 1850s. He is now in his detective fangirl era. Let's do a little refresher. So the first police force in Britain is established in 1829. The first detective force established in 1842. And Charles Dickens meets a lot of these detectives around 1850, and then goes on to write a novel which features a detective in 1852 to 1853. That detective that he met and based, well, I'm not giving anything away, but the detective that he met in 1850 that really, really impressed him was Inspector Field, Charles Frederick Field, who joins the police department in the year that it's founded, joins the detective force only a few years after that's founded, meets Charles Dickens in 1850. There's this little article that Dickens writes in one of the magazines that he runs called a detective police party. Because remember, he's a detective fangirl. He hosts this party just because he wants to meet them and then write about them and make everyone else love them too. Detectives and the police were usually, almost always, in the lower class of society. And so they were kind of outsiders in that they didn't run in the same spheres and the same circles as the upper class people, but they were also protecting them from the other lower class people who were criminals and all these different things. And so people were just naturally suspicious of these people. And so Charles Dickens is kind of their campaigner, unasked, but he's their campaigner and trying to get people to like them. And in it, he writes this, in a detective police party, he writes this description of Inspector Field, whom he calls Inspector Wield, and he talks about how he has this corpulent forefinger, which he's always shaking at everyone. I need you to remember that. We're going to get back to that in a second. He also writes another article called On Duty with Inspector Field, and it's adorable. I mean, it's him just following Inspector Field around and going he's just so good at his job. How does he do it? This guy's amazing. Shortly after he writes these pieces, he begins writing Bleak House. And in Bleak House, there's a character called Inspector Bucket, who also has a corpulent forefinger that he wags at everybody else. It is very clearly based on Inspector Field. One of the coolest things about Inspector Bucket is that he happens to be one of the very first detectives in English fiction. So this is the granddad of Sherlock Holmes, Inspector Bucket. And I just want to say, before we go on to the next couple slides, I read all of Bleak House in 16 days to make these slides. So I just need you to appreciate how many hours went into making these. Okay, anyway, we can move on. So Bleak House gives us the first fictional professional detective, but it also gives us a few examples of the amateur detective. One of them is Inspector Bucket's wife, Mrs. Bucket, whom Dickens pretty explicitly says, yeah, she's an amateur detective. She's got all the skills. And the amateur detective in English fiction kind of surpasses, especially in the Golden Age, the professional detective. I mean, think now of Agatha Christie's detectives, Poirot, Miss Marple, Dorothy Sayers' detective, Peter Wimsey, Chesterton's detective, Father Brown, all of these different people, they're all amateurs. None of them are professional in professional capacities. And so we kind of see the roots of this beginning in the same book that gives us the first professional detective. detective genre to come. I mean, you've got the professionally amateur detectives, but you've also got murder. Does a second one happen? I don't know. You'll have to read that thing to find out. It's got a falsely accused suspect. It's got plenty of red herrings, and it also has evidence. It also gives the reader clues. Not tons and tons and tons, but we're starting to see the kind of puzzle mystery begin to take shape in Dickens' novel Bleak House. Now, Charles Dickens, his very last crime era is the mysterious mystery era, because one of his very last novels, his very last novel that he was working on, was one called The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which I have in its original wrappings right here, which you can see after, if you like. And one of the biggest mysteries of The Mystery of Edwin Drood is the fact that he doesn't finish it. And so, in kind of this meta move, nobody actually knows how Edwin Drood is going to end. So the mystery of the book is the book itself, right? And it kind of takes this life of its own, though, because of that kind of intriguing aspect, that unfinished aspect of it. This is an example of a novel that was not written by Dickens, but was published a year or two after Edwin Drood. It's called John Jasper's Secret. John Jasper was a character in Edwin Drood, and what this book is it's a continuation, one of the very first, if not the first, kind of fan fictions of Edwin Drood, of someone taking up the mantle and finishing it for Dickens. This happens, we'll just put him here. This happens, again, in just the best ways. A lot of times, this is one of my favorite examples of Edwin Drood kind of lore, Edwin Drood lore. This is G.K. Chesterton, and in 1914, he and a cohort of other Dickens fans got together in an actual courthouse in London, and they held a trial for John Jasper, trying to see if he was actually guilty of the murder of Edwin Drood. Of course, Chesterton goes on to, well, he actually had done this by this point. He's the author of the Father Brown stories. This gentleman here, when he was in his spiritualist era, toward the end of his life, held a seance wherein he calls forth the spirit of Dickens to ask him, what happened to Edwin Drood? Where did he go? How did he die? This, of course, is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the inventor of Sherlock Holmes. So, what does Charles Dickens do for the Whodunnit? He brings positive attention to the detective force. He creates one of the first major detectives in English fiction. He contributes to the rising popularity of the genre. I mean, people love Dickens, they love reading Dickens. And so anything that he does for the genre is a big step because it's Dickens doing it. So of course people are gonna follow him. He also influences later key figures of the genre, like Chesterton and Doyle, who are both really, really big names in the world of detective fiction. Okay, so there we have Dickens. Hope you got all that down in your heads. So who do we want to examine next? Super. Okay, so Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. We are saying it was he, Sir Arthur, with Sherlock Holmes. In A Study in Scarlet and the Successive Holmes books and stories, who contributed greatly to the history of detective fiction. Do we stand by this accusation? Shall we go on?
Yes.
There it is. It's a little weak, but that's okay. We can work on that. Okay, so with these slides, I like to approach these authors, these books, with some kind of an angle, some kind of interesting argument to make. And with Sherlock, I mean, there's so many avenues to go down. He's a massive figure in the history of this genre. So what I want to do is just get a few out of the way. Yes, it is true that Doyle hated Sherlock and killed him off only to resurrect him by popular demand later. Yes, it is true that Sherlock never says "Elementary, my dear Watson" in any of the Doyle stories. It is true that Sherlock was originally called Sherringford. It is also true that Doyle never dressed Sherlock in specifically a deerstalker hat. That came from stage adaptations later on. It is furthermore true that Moriarty appears or is mentioned, mostly just mentioned, in only a handful of Sherlock stories. It is also true that most Sherlock stories were published in the 20th century. So that late Victorian idea that we have of, bustling coaches and foggy London is like kind of true in the beginning of Sherlock's story, but most of the stories are written and even set in the 1900s, the 1910s, and the 1920s. In fact, there's a collection of stories called His Last Bow, which makes Sherlock a hero of World War I. Kind of fun. It is also true that A Study in Scarlet, the first story/novel in which Sherlock appeared, was a flop. Now, before we go on to what I actually want to talk about with Sherlock Holmes, I do want to tell you probably my favorite fact about Sherlock is that one time, so we're setting the scene, it's 1890, and Arthur Conan Doyle is at a party hosted by the editor of Lippincott's magazine, which is an American literary magazine, and the editor comes up to him and he says, "Hey Arthur, so you know that Sherlock guy that you wrote that novel about a few years ago? Yeah, I kind of think, it wouldn't be such a bad thing, if you wrote a novel about him again." And so Arthur is like, "Yes sir, can do." At the same party, though, is one Oscar Wilde. And the editor of Lippincott's goes up to him and he's like, "Hey, Oscar, so, I don't know, I know you haven't really done much with novels before, but I kind of think it would be pretty cool if you wrote one for, my magazine." So he does. And in the same year, we get Arthur Conan Doyle's second Sherlock novel, The Sign of the Four, and Oscar Wilde's one and only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, appearing in the same magazine. Kind of fun. What a dinner party. Wow. Anyway, but what I really want to address is, what is it that makes Sherlock work? Why are there lists online of Sherlock Holmes myths and facts that we can search up? Why does he occupy such a massive place in popular culture that anyone would think to publish multiple articles like that on the internet? It's especially interesting to think about why Sherlock works when another detective, written by Edgar Allan Poe and published 45 years before, didn't take off. Why is it that the second, great detective far surpasses the first, the original, in popularity? I mean, even in the very first Sherlock story, Watson goes up to Sherlock and he says, "Oh, you remind me of Edgar Allan Poe's Japan," which is the detective C. Auguste Japan in the stories. And I think a big reason why Sherlock works and Japan just has not occupied the same place in any degree as Sherlock does in popular culture is because Doyle looks at what works in the Japan stories and he just amplifies it to an 11 out of 10. Japan is an eccentric. Well, Sherlock's going to be even more eccentric. Japan is logical. Well, Sherlock's going to be even more logical. Japan is like a reasoning machine. Well, Sherlock's going to be even more of a reasoning machine. But crucially, I think he also makes Sherlock more human than Japan is. We don't see Sherlock's humanity. He is pretty much like a machine for a lot of these stories. But we do see it come up every now and then, especially in regards to his friend and the narrator of these stories, Watson. This is from a later story, 1926, where he's talking in kind of a disparaging way about Watson. But in the end, his conclusion is that Watson is indeed an ideal helpmate. There could not be a better friend for Sherlock than Watson, and Sherlock acknowledges this and is grateful for this. Here are a few more little quotes that we have about Sherlock praising Watson. Now, this of course leads us to our next point, which is a word on Watson. Oh my goodness, how did that get there? Watson. And that is, Watson is really, he's an unsung hero of these stories. He honestly is one of the biggest reasons why these stories work. So much so that Agatha Christie, through her detective, who killed Poirot, made a note that it really isn't Sherlock that makes these stories so good. They're far-fetched. They're full of fallacies and artificial contrivances. What really makes them, well, one is that they're just fun stories. They're well written, but also it's that Watson. And Watson is so critical to these because, remember, Sherlock is like a machine. He's inaccessible to the reader. He's really comforting to the reader because he acts as this He proves that human rationality can solve almost any problem, and that's a nice thing to see. But he's not the kindest individual. He's not the most relatable individual. But Watson is. He's the everyman. He's intentionally the everyman, and he's the one telling these stories to us. He acts as the mediator between the reader and Sherlock. And this works so well, and Christie knows that it works so well, that she even gives Poirot his own Watson, especially in the earlier novels and stories in Captain Arthur Hastings. Look at them, they're so cute. So, what does Arthur Conan Doyle do for the whodunit? He creates Sherlock Holmes. And that's like pretty much all you need to say about that. And so why does Sherlock Holmes work? He's a stabilizing force. He's socially consoling. He's eccentric. He's just fun to watch on the page. He appears serially, so we get him again and again and again. We can be familiar with him, and we can also see him in all of these different settings where there are all these different problems, and guess who's going to solve every one of them? It's Sherlock Holmes. He also deals with the everyday. There aren't a lot of Sherlock stories which deal with murder or international intrigue. A lot of them are just petty thefts or weird goings-on, like a fake ginger, redhead club. Anyway, Holmes is still human. He's not super good at being human, but he is still human. And of course, Watson is the perfect medium between Holmes and the reader, because whatever deficiencies Sherlock has as a human, Watson makes up for them tenfold. And again, like Christie says through Poirot, they're just good stories. They're fun to read, they're easy to read, but they're still intelligent. It's just a good time all around. And so, of course, every fictional detective since Sherlock Holmes has either been a kind of echo of him or a deliberate subversion of the character. All right, so we'll probably do one more. So who wants to have a final say? Agatha Christie. Fun fact, she works for a parody of the Beatles' Eleanor Rigby really well, so that's just waiting to happen. Okay, so, okay, I'll pretend that didn't happen. So, we're saying that it was Agatha Christie with Hercule Poirot in The Mysterious Affair at Styles, and who contributes greatly to the history of detective fiction. Do we stand by this accusation? Shall we go on?
Yes.
There it is. Do it again, just for old time's sake.
Yes.
Okay, well done. Okay, so let me tell you a little story. Once upon a time, there lived a woman called Margaret Madge Miller Watts, and she had a sister, you'll never guess who it is, named Agatha. Let's fast forward a few years, let's say to, 1916. Madge looks at Agatha and then she says, Agatha, my dear friend, my bosom sister, and also biological sister, I challenge thee, as the promising young woman that you are, to writing a mystery novel. And Agatha says, why, Madge? I would love to. And she takes up the gauntlet and she writes what becomes The Mysterious Affair at Styles. This is her very first published novel, and is published in 1920. It takes a few years to get published. It's rejected by six publishers, and only accepted by the last one, under the condition that Christie change one really crucial scene. And what this is at the very end of the novel, Christie originally had her detective strolling into the witness box and spewing evidence in every direction. And the publisher of The Bodley Head, John Lane, was like, my dear Agatha, my good woman, that's not how the law works. You can't give evidence in the witness box. You either need to consult a lawyer or you need to just change the setting completely. And so Agatha does. And you know where she puts her detective and all the little suspects? She puts them in the drawing room. This is where we get the drawing room denouement. There's my French for you. Thank you. So this is a really important feature that we get through the rest, really, of the century. You know, everyone all gathered together as they are in these films or plays, and explained, all the pieces all coming together. drawing room. But it's important to note who the detective is that Agatha writes for this novel, and it is none other than Hercule Poirot. This novel, yes. What? What? Why? Why? Why would that happen? Why would you do this to me? Oh my goodness, that pair threw me off my groove. Yeah, now you know the ending. There's no point to staying. Anyway, so Poirot, Hercule Poirot, what a guy. He is everything that the detective really shouldn't be, or at least if we're looking at Sherlock as the standard, he's the complete inversion of it, where Sherlock is tall and angular, Poirot is short and kind of rotund and has a head the shape of an egg, whatever that means. Where Sherlock is willing to, get down on his knees and look at every particle of dust to see what it's going to tell him about the case. Poirot refuses to. Oh my goodness, that's such a not neat behavior, and instead relies on, his little grey cells to psychologically work through the probabilities of the case. He is also, and this is really important, not English. So he can look as an outsider looking in, which is important for detectives, but it also brings up a really, really crucial point that I do want to make for Agatha, and that is kind of noting the time in which Styles is written and published. So Poirot is Belgian. In 1914, England joins World War I after Germany has invaded Belgium, which is a neutral country. And after this, thousands of Belgian refugees come flooding into Great Britain, seeking refuge. And Poirot is one of these, and actually allegedly based off of a refugee that Agatha once saw and interacted with. So he's kind of this byproduct of the war. His Watson figure, Captain Hastings, is another byproduct of the war. He's a captain who's convalescing at the house Styles from the Western Front. There's also a character who, like Agatha, was a war nurse and is one of the suspects because she, deals with poisons as any good medical person would. And I think this is really important, at least in my mind, because Agatha Christie, there's this myth that kind of swirls around her in that she exists perpetually in 1934, and there's no awareness of the contemporality of her stories. But I mean, you look here, and from the very beginning, her very first novel, she's already looking around at the world she's inhabiting and picking really specific details to build it. And she does this for the remainder of her career into the 70s. She dies in 1976. And even if it's just passing references, oh, now there's a war on, oh, we're still rationing, there's still this understanding that she is living in a modern world and she knows exactly the ways in which it's changing. So there's a little note on World War I. The mysterious affair at Styles is kind of a wonder in literary history, just in that all of the things that we're going to know Agatha Christie for are kind of already there in her very first novel. I mean, the very first novel she writes, or publishes, is a mystery novel. The very first detective she introduces us to is her most famous detective, Poirot. She gives us the drawing room denouement. She gives us the country house murder. I mean, there are other murders and intrigues that happen in fiction in country houses before this point, but it isn't until Christie that they happen in the country house and then stay in the country house. You never leave the country house, and you never leave with your closed or closed suspects either. A very specific group of people that are there for the whole time. That's another Christie development. She also makes the puzzle one of the most important, if not the sole aspect of these stories. She's not trying to write novels with really deep social commentary, even if those kind of do come as byproducts. She's not trying to include crazy romantic subplots that have nothing to do with the story. Everything that happens in the novel has to do with the puzzle mystery. And this is something that Agatha Christie does pretty much first and what she does the best. Alright, let's fast forward a bit. Let's jump 6 years. We're back to Madge and Agatha. Agatha's doing pretty well. She's published a few more mystery novels. By this point, it's 1926. And she decides, I'm going to write another one. I'm going to write another one, and it's going to be so good, no one is going to see what's coming in this one. And she dedicates it to her sister Madge, whom she calls Punky for whatever reason, on the dedication page. And the novel is, of course, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. Has anyone read Ackroyd before? Repent ye, repent ye. It is so good. It's so good. And it kind of launches Agatha Christie into the stardom that she'll enjoy for the rest of her life. And one of the reasons why it's so good and so gripping is it's really controversial. Like, if the internet had existed in 1926, it would have snapped it clean in half. Now remember, the golden age, from our little whistle-stop tour, is a time when the rules of detective fiction are standardized. This is an example of some of the commandments that were written by, this one in particular is by Ronald Knox, published in 1929, so just a few years after Ackroyd is published. And I won't be too specific here, but Ackroyd does break one of these rules. And when it breaks one of those rules, everyone's just in an uproar. They're like, is this fair? Is this okay? And so you have people reacting in this way, like, well, let me tell you what is okay. But I mean, it works for Agatha. It's so clever, it's so good, that, again, like I said, it launches her into the success that she'll enjoy for the rest of her life. She publishes a total of 66 mystery novels before she dies. They're still selling in the billions. You've got countless adaptations made from them for every generation that comes through. She's read second only to Shakespeare in the Bible, which is to say that she is read just after the Bard himself and also God. Like, she's a big deal. And also that she earns the name the Queen of Crime. But the Golden Age is an interesting time, and something that I want to focus on now is that, yes, she is the Queen of Crime, but there are plenty of Queens of Crime that are writing during this era. This is a really, really big era for the kind of surge of women writers of detective fiction. Here are the four most famous. We have Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, Marjorie Allingham, and then a Guy Marsh on the bottom there. And something that happens because we have more women writing these stories is we have these stories happening in spheres that women live in and know well. Again, this is the period of the country house murder. Why is it the period of the country house murder? Because the home is the women's domain, right? And so these are women writing about scenarios that they would be familiar with, could write convincingly about, with suspects that they could write convincingly about, because they're interacting day to day with the vicar, with knitting in sweaters and things like that. But we also get, because we have more women writing these stories, more women solving the crimes within the stories. Miss Marple is the best. She's the best. And she's one of really the first female detectives to come out of literature in years. In the 1860s, there's this weird little spike where you have a couple novels that are published about female detectives. One is The Revelations of a Lady Detective. One is just called The Female Detective. But after that, it's kind of like crickets. Until 1930-ish, when we get publication of The Murder of the Vicarage, our very first Miss Marple novel. And something that's cool about Miss Marple is not only is she the first, or one of the first, and probably the most famous female detectives just ever, but she's quintessentially female in the way that she detects the crimes. She's this unassuming, little old, unmarried busybody. And because of that, and she uses that to her advantage, because no one's really paying attention to what this little old, unmarried busybody is doing in the corner, but she's watching everything, and she's putting it together. So she's using her unassuming femaleness to her advantage to be a detective. Also, I ought to say that it is Agatha's birthday tomorrow. She'll be 134. My, how they do grow up so fast. So cheers to her. Happy birthday, Agatha. Alright, so what does Agatha Christie do for the whodunit? A lot of things. She pretty much kicks off the Golden Age and gives us a lot of the familiar tropes, the sights and sounds that we know so well today. She creates these two very famous detectives, Poirot and Marple, who act as foils to what we'd expect of detectives. They're these weird, eccentric outsiders. No one sees them coming. She contributes to the kind of feminization of the detective genre. she domesticates the genre. She puts us in the country house and leaves us there. She makes the puzzle the main event. And she brings the genre to new heights of popularity and just blows everyone's minds as she does still to this day. Okay, so it is now 9:10. How are we feeling? What does this mean?
Satisfied.
Satisfied? Okay, perfect. So, let us now convene together. We've taken some notes. We've closed our notebooks. I think we are ready to make the final accusation. Do you?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, so we have a little clue envelope. Sorry for those who might not remember this feature of the board game. And I think we are now ready for the moment. This calls for a drum roll to find out who done the whodunit. And you'll never guess, but it was the friends we made along the way. Oh, isn't that nice? No, but like typical historians answer, it's complicated. There's not just one person who contributes, everything to the genre. It's a whole conglomeration of them. Do we have any questions? Yes.
How many Christies have you read?
None. I've never read a knight. I don't even know who she is. That's a good question. I actually am not super sure. It's somewhere between 20 and 30. She's really good. She's so good, yes.
Favorite Agatha Christie?
We'll get to that in a second.
Alright.
Okay.
Very well for the answer.
Someone knows the answer. Oh, yeah. Do you know the answer too?
No.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
This might be an unfair question, but
Oh boy.
do you know how the detective genre relates to film noir?
Yes. I actually have a section on that, which we don't have to go into, but I do have a section on it. So how the question is, how does the detective genre relate to film noir, right? Okay. So you might remember from the very beginning when we were going through our whistle-stop tour, the American response to the Golden Age, the kind of cozy English crime novel, is the hard-boiled private eye. And remember, so the Golden Age is happening in the 20s and the 30s. And so it's an interesting time for the US to respond by inventing its own genre, the hard-boiled thing, because Hollywood is kind of taking off, especially during the 30s. It's really, really starting to be very popular in the 30s. And so you have all of these newly published novels that people are just eating up about the hard-boiled private eye. And so people are picking up these films all over. I mean, Humphrey Bogart plays two of the most famous hard-boiled detectives in hard-boiled history. Philip Marlowe, who is Raymond Chandler's detective, and Sam Spade, who is Dashiell Hammett's detective. And so it just happens that the time when Hollywood is kind of taking off and figuring out what it's doing is a time when these novels are being published and are both are becoming really popular. So yeah, does that answer the question? No. Okay, perfect. Anything else? Yes?
How did you get so good at explaining all of this?
I was like, wait, what do you?
Like the knowledge and all that stuff.
When I was young, I didn't have many friends, but I read a lot of books and I love learning, and I've always loved learning, and I love shoving my learning down other people's throats. And so, but I also feel, you watch it, but I also feel really passionate about kind of the axis, because like I love history and I love literature. But I know it's not everybody's cup of tea. It's most people's appetite? Cup? What? I don't know. Anyway, it's not everyone's cup of tea. And so but I feel really strongly that it can do so much good, people knowing history and literature. And so I want to figure out ways to make these things more accessible. And so I love to try to just figure out, okay, what do I love about learning history and literature, and how can I use that to make sure that everyone else is also having fun learning these things? So, yes?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but several sections ago, was that a picture of Jude Law played Watson, and so what version would that be in?
The first picture was not. I don't.
Okay.
I had a great time though googling Jude Law young. Would recommend that activity to anybody. So that was the origin of that slide.
Alright.
Okay. Are we satisfied? We've solved the mysteries of the universe. No one has any questions ever again. Perfect. Okay, so going along with the question that you had, which Agatha Christie novel is my favorite? Probably The Hollow. Although all of these are really, really good. And if you're interested in getting into Agatha Christie, these are 10 that I would recommend. They're in a weird order. It's the order if you're only to read 10 Agatha Christie novels in the course of your life. These are novels I choose in the order that I'd read them in. But really starting with any of them is fine. They're all really good. And if you're hooked at that point, here are a few more that I would recommend. Also, take this moment to plug my very favorite Agatha Christie adaptation, 2022's mini-series. Why did they ask of it? It's so ridiculous, but it's so much fun, and it's also just gorgeous to watch. But if you're also interested in the history of mystery, on the left I have some more recommendations for books to read. I also have these recommendations in slips of paper right there, so if you want to take those home. Not my books, those are mine, but the slips, you can do that. Also, if you maybe want a little boost in your Agatha Christie journey, we are doing a book club for A Murder Is Announced. Here's my copy here. It's a Marple novel, one of the best. And because chocolate cake features prominently in the plot, there may be cake present at this book club as well. And scintillating discussion, which will really feed your souls. Okay.
Coming soon to theaters.
So if you are interested in attending any more events or just curious on what's going on at Artifacts within the next couple months, here are a few things. Again, we've got book club. We have book club again in October. We're reading North and Gravity by Jane Austen. The mall is doing a retro day in beginning of October. The owner of this collection will be doing a kind of show and tell for the highlights of these things. Also in October, in November we'll have Pups and Poetry. Woohoo. Yes.
What is Pups and Poetry?
You know, I'm not super sure, but I know there will be dogs there and also books. So yeah. All right. So everyone has that down if they're interested in any of that. And of course, what's this deja vu? Anyway, if you are interested in keeping up with what we're doing, we have our Facebook and Instagram here. Delightful content always. But then in the middle we have a survey, which it means so much to get feedback for these things. Like, you have no idea how many people would have been saved so much grief if more people would do these surveys and say things like, will you please shut charity up? So if you could please, say what you liked, what you didn't like, and a few other questions. It's all anonymous, and all the questions are optional. That would be wonderful. Yes?
There's a scale of 1 to 5. Is 1 like amazing, or is 1 horrible?
Horrible?
Okay, so you may get some 1s because people are presuming
Okay. No one has so far.
Okay, so they're understanding the scale.
Yeah.
Or they,
Yes.
Or they think it's bad.
Or they think it's really
Or they
bad.
think 1.
No, I'm just deluding myself. Yes?
What was that coworker's name that made the game?
Anya.
A-M-Y-A.
Yeah. Yep, yep, yep. Okay, and as you're working on that, we have this little tradition here at Artifacts of History, where to ensure that we always end on a high note, we have our little friend, who I'm going to introduce to you now, Jazzercise Pear. Jazzercise Pear. So that is all that I have for you tonight. If you want to come and see any of these books up close, you're welcome to. If any further questions, also welcome to ask those. But otherwise, just enjoy his spectacular moves. And that's all. I don't know. A mystery we'll never solve. So anyway, that's all. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.